Why are smaller companies outperforming yours in Asia? The CEO asked with a careless smile, loud enough for his entire table to hear. And a few of his executives chuckled as if the answer didn't matter, but the waitress standing beside him did not laugh. She simply set his sparkling water down with steady hands and looked at him like the question deserved a real answer. The rain outside Manhattan's glass skyline blurred into streaks of silver as Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, his Patek Philippe catching the light. "Relax, it's just a question," he added, waving his hand as if dismissing her before she even spoke. But Emily Carter didn't move. Her black apron was pressed, her posture straight, and her eyes sharp in a way that didn't belong to someone refilling drinks for $12 an hour. "Then I'll give you a real answer," she said, her voice calm. And that alone shifted something at the table. One executive stopped mid-sip. Another lowered his fork onto a plate of dry-aged steak. Daniel tilted his head slightly, curiosity replacing amusement. "Go ahead," he said, this time watching her, really watching. Emily reached into her apron and pulled out a pen, then flipped over the receipt he had just signed. She drew a quick circle, then another inside it, her movements precise. "You built a system designed for control," she said, tapping the outer ring. "They built systems designed for speed," she added, tapping the center. "You acquire companies, then force them to slow down to match you," she continued, sliding the receipt across the table. "They stay small enough to move before you even finish a meeting." One of the younger executives leaned forward, squinting at the sketch. Daniel's expression tightened just slightly. "That's a simplified take," he replied, his tone still controlled, but no longer dismissive. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "It's a precise one," she said, and for a second, the noise of the restaurant faded behind them. A server dropped a tray somewhere across the room. A couple laughed near the bar, but at table 12, no one moved. Daniel picked up the receipt, studying the circles like they might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" he asked, not accusing, just calculating. Emily hesitated for half a breath, then adjusted the silverware beside his plate, aligning the knife perfectly parallel to the fork. "From watching people who don't listen," she said quietly, and that answer landed harder than anything before it. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, a habit his board recognized when something caught his attention. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. One of his executives shifted uncomfortably. "Daniel," the man began, but Daniel didn't look away from her. "5 minutes," he added, his voice firm. Emily glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him, weighing something no one else could see. "I'm working," she replied, and there was no apology in it, just fact. Daniel almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "So am I," he said, then leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to turn the moment into something private. "And I think you just pointed out a problem my team hasn't seen in 2 years. Emily held his gaze, steady, unshaken, but something flickered there, not fear, not pride, something deeper, like she already knew more than she had said. She reached for the receipt again, tapped the inner circle once more, and spoke a sentence that made the executive beside Daniel straighten instantly. "You didn't just slow them down," she said. "You buried the one division that could have saved your expansion." Daniel's hand froze over the table, and for the first time that night, he didn't have a response ready, because somewhere in that quiet, unsettling certainty, there was a possibility he had overlooked something, or worse, someone had made sure he did. Daniel did not sit back down. He stayed leaning forward, one hand still resting on the edge of the table, eyes locked on Emily as if the rest of the restaurant had disappeared. "Explain that," he said quietly, and this time it was not a request. It was a command sharpened by something new, something closer to concern. Emily glanced at the receipt again, then at the laptop one of the executives had already opened, its screen glowing with spreadsheets and quarterly projections. "Pull up your Southeast Asia logistics acquisition from 18 months ago," she said, and the younger executive hesitated before typing quickly, the soft clicking of keys cutting through the silence. "Division name?" he asked. "Kensington Freight Solutions," Emily replied without missing a beat. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, recognition flickering. "That was a small buy," he said, more to himself than to her. "We integrated it into our core operations, Emily nodded once. Exactly, she said, then stepped closer to the table, pointing at the screen as the data loaded. Before you acquired them, they were moving regional shipments in 48 hours on average, she said, her finger tracing a column of numbers. After integration, your system pushed them to 96. The executive frowned, scrolling. That cannot be right, he muttered. But the numbers stayed, clear and unarguable. Daniel straightened slowly, his hand dropping from the table. That delay would not matter at scale, he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Emily shook her head. It matters when your competitors are winning contracts based on speed, not size, she replied, then reached for the salt shaker, placing it beside the receipt as if building a physical model. You thought you were adding strength, she continued, placing the pepper shaker next to it. But you diluted their advantage. One of the older executives leaned back, arms crossed. So what are you suggesting? He asked, his tone edged with skepticism. Emily did not look at him. She kept her focus on Daniel. You already had what you are trying to build now, she said, her voice steady. You just buried it under your own structure. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked past her, out toward the rain streaking the windows, as if recalculating something far larger than the room. Run the contract losses in that region, he said suddenly. Turning to his team, the younger executive typed faster, pulling up another set of numbers, his eyes widening slightly as the figures appeared. We have lost 12% market share in the last year, he said, glancing up, mostly to smaller firms. A quiet shift moved through the table, subtle but undeniable. Daniel exhaled slowly, then looked back at Emily. You are telling me I caused that, he said, and it was not defensive anymore. It was precise. Emily held his gaze. I am telling you that you removed the only part of your company that could compete with them, she replied, and the words landed with weight. Daniel reached for the receipt again, staring at the simple circle she had drawn, his reflection faintly visible in the polished table surface. Who else knows this? He asked, his voice low, controlled. Emily hesitated for the first time, just a fraction of a second. Then she straightened the edge of the receipt, aligning it perfectly with the table's grain. Anyone who has looked closely enough, she said. But there was something in the way she said it, something careful. Daniel noticed, his eyes narrowing slightly. That is not what I asked, he said. Emily met his gaze again, calm but measured. Then maybe you should ask why no one on your team brought it to you, she replied, and that shifted the tension entirely. One of the executives looked away, another cleared his throat, the laptop screen still glowing with numbers that now felt heavier than before. Daniel stood fully this time, his chair sliding back with a quiet scrape against the floor. Give me a full report on Kensington, he said, his tone firm, decisive. Tonight. The team moved instantly, chairs shifting, phones coming out, but Daniel did not follow them. He stayed where he was, watching Emily as she stepped back from the table, returning to her position as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just altered the direction of a billion-dollar conversation. Emily, he said, stopping her before she could turn away. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. Yes, she replied. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then asked the question that had been building beneath everything else. How did you know about Kensington? And this time, Emily did not answer right away, because the truth was not just about what she knew. It was about how she knew it, and whether Daniel Whitmore was ready to hear that someone inside his own company had already tried to warn him. Emily did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to make Daniel feel it, not as hesitation, but as a decision being weighed in real time. She glanced toward the kitchen where the stainless steel doors swung open and closed, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing as if nothing had shifted. Then she reached into her apron again and pulled out something smaller than the receipt, a folded piece of paper worn at the edges. Because I helped build it, she said, unfolding it carefully and placing it on the table. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the header. Kensington Freight Solutions, Internal Operations Draft, dated 2 years ago. The margins filled with handwritten notes in blue ink, diagrams not unlike the ones she had just drawn, but more detailed, more precise. This was not public, one of the executives said, his voice low with concern. Emily did not look at him. It was not supposed to be, she replied. Daniel picked up the paper, his fingers tracing the ink as if trying to confirm it was real. You worked for them, he said. And it was not a question anymore. Emily nodded once. I was part of a 3-person team designing their rapid routing model, she said. And for the first time, there was a shift in how the room saw her, not as a server who surprised them, but as someone who had been inside something they had overlooked. Daniel's mind moved quickly now, connecting timelines, acquisition reports, integration failures. Then why are you here? He asked, his voice quieter, more controlled. Emily's gaze dropped briefly to the table, to the perfectly aligned silverware she had adjusted minutes ago, then back to him. Because when your company acquired us, they did not keep the team, she said, and that sentence landed heavier than any number on the screen. One executive shifted in his seat. Another closed his laptop halfway, as if the glow of it had become uncomfortable. We were told our model would be reviewed. Emily continued, her tone steady but edged with something that had been carried for a long time. 3 weeks later, we were replaced by your integration consultants. Daniel's jaw tightened again. But this time it was not defensiveness. It was recognition of a pattern he had seen before but never felt this close. That decision would not have come across my desk, he said, and even as he said it, he knew how that sounded. Emily gave a small nod, not agreeing, not arguing, just acknowledging the distance between his position and the reality. Beneath it, exactly, she said, and that word held more weight than accusation. Daniel set the paper down slowly, flattening it against the table as if trying to hold the moment in place. What happened after? He asked, and now there was something different in his voice, not curiosity, not control, something closer to accountability. Emily exhaled softly, then answered without dramatics. We were let go, she said. 2 months later, Kensington's delivery times doubled, she added, and the younger executive glanced back at the laptop as if confirming what they had already seen. Daniel looked at her again, really looked this time, at the way she stood, composed, at the way her words carried precision without needing volume. And you ended up here, he said. Emily's lips pressed together briefly. Then she gave a small, almost ironic smile. Rent is due. Whether your model works or not, she replied, and a few of the executives shifted again, this time not from skepticism, but from discomfort at how simple that truth was. Daniel let out a slow breath, then reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, dialing quickly. Cancel the Singapore expansion review tomorrow, he said when the line connected. I want a full audit on Kensington integration, internal and external, and I want every consultant report from that period on my desk by morning. He ended the call before waiting for a response, sliding the phone back into his pocket. Then he looked at Emily again. If what you are saying is accurate, he began, but Emily cut in, not raising her voice, just finishing the thought before he could soften it. It is, she said, and that certainty shifted the balance again, just slightly. Daniel nodded once, accepting that for now, then gestured toward the paper. This, he said, you kept it. Emily's fingers brushed the edge of the worn page, because I knew someone would need to see it eventually, she replied, and there it was again, that layer beneath everything. Something intentional, something patient. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in realization that this moment might not be as accidental as it seemed. Did you know it would be me? He asked, and for the first time since the conversation began. Emily did not answer immediately, because the truth was not just about timing, it was about whether she had been waiting for this exact moment all along. Emily held his gaze for 1 second longer, then reached back into her apron as if she had already made the decision before he even asked. No, she said quietly. I did not know it would be you. And she placed a second folded document on the table, thicker this time, creased down the middle from being carried for too long. Daniel did not touch it right away. His eyes stayed on her face, searching for something that would tell him how far this went. Then why keep all this? He asked, and his voice carried a sharper edge now, not hostile, but focused. Emily slid the document closer to him. Because someone altered it, she said, and that was new. That changed the air completely. One of the executives straightened in his chair. Altered what? He asked, but Emily ignored him, her attention fixed on Daniel. Daniel finally picked up the document and unfolded it slowly. Inside were printed pages, internal emails, timestamps, and a version of the Kensington integration report that looked almost identical to what his company had archived. Almost. Look at page 3, Emily said, and Daniel flipped to it, his eyes scanning quickly, then stopping. There was a section highlighted in yellow, a paragraph describing projected delivery times post-integration. These numbers, he said, tapping the page. They match our internal report. Emily nodded once, then pulled the receipt back toward her and drew 2 columns side by side. Now compare them to this, she said, pointing to a second set of figures printed just below, smaller, almost hidden in the formatting. Daniel leaned in closer, his expression tightening as he noticed the discrepancy. The original projection showed a marginal delay, manageable, but the lower set, the one almost buried in the document, showed a doubling of delivery time within 6 months. Why are there 2 projections? He asked, and this time the question carried weight. Emily met his eyes. Because the first one is the version your executives approved, she said, then tapped the second set. And this is the version we actually submitted. The silence that followed was different from before. It was heavier, more dangerous in its implication. One executive stood up halfway. That is not possible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel did not look at him. He kept reading, flipping back through the pages, cross-checking timestamps, email headers, names. Who sent this? He asked, and Emily pointed to a line near the top. Your senior integration lead, she said. Daniel's eyes locked onto the name, Richard Halpern, and something in his posture changed instantly, a subtle shift, but enough that everyone at the table felt it. He has been with me for 8 years, Daniel said, more to himself than to anyone else. Emily nodded. Then you know how much authority he had over that process, she replied. Daniel exhaled slowly, then pulled out his phone again, this time not dialing immediately, just holding it as he looked at the document one more time. If this is accurate, he said, and stopped, because he already knew it was. Emily did not fill the silence. She let it sit, let him reach that conclusion on his own. One of the executives leaned forward, lowering his voice. Daniel, we should verify before making any assumptions. Daniel finally looked up, his expression calm, but colder now. More precise. We are past assumptions, he said, and that line settled the room. He tapped the name on the page once more, then looked back at Emily. Why bring this to me now? He asked, and this time there was no edge, just direct intent. Emily's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the document. Then she answered, because tonight is the first time you asked the right question, she said, and that answer shifted something again, not just in him, but in the way the entire situation unfolded. Daniel nodded once, slow, deliberate, then finally dialed. Get me Richard Halpern, he said into the phone, his voice controlled. Now. He ended the call and set the phone down on the table, right beside the document, then looked back at Emily, studying her like she was no longer part of the room. But the reason it had changed. If he denies this, Daniel said quietly, I will need more than paper. Emily did not flinch. She reached into her apron one last time and pulled out a small USB drive, placing it next to his phone with a soft, deliberate motion. Then you should see the version he never meant anyone to find, she said. And for the first time that night, Daniel realized this was not just a mistake buried in his company. It was something far more deliberate, and whatever was inside that drive was going to decide who he could trust when the truth finally surfaced. The phone rang once, then twice. Then Daniel ended the call before it could connect, his thumb pressing the screen with a precision that felt more deliberate than hesitation, and that small action shifted the room again. Because it meant he was choosing control over reaction. He looked at the USB drive resting beside his glass, then at Emily. If this is what you say it is, he said, his voice steady but lower now. You just handed me something that could dismantle my own leadership team. Emily did not respond immediately. She adjusted the edge of the document again, aligning it with the table like before, a small habit that seemed to anchor her in moments like this. I handed you what was already there, she replied, and that distinction mattered. Daniel nodded once, then turned to his executives. Everyone except Mark stays, he said, and the older executive who had questioned Emily earlier stiffened slightly. Daniel, this is not how we handle internal matters, he began, but Daniel cut him off with a glance. Not loud, not aggressive, just final. It is tonight. he said. And that was the decision. Chairs shifted. Two men stood and quietly stepped away from the table, leaving a tighter circle. Behind, the younger executive, Mark, remained seated, his laptop still open, fingers hovering above the keyboard as if waiting for instruction. Daniel slid the USB drive toward him. Offline machine, he said. Mark nodded quickly, closing the laptop and pulling a second device from his bag. A smaller, secured unit with no network connection. A detail that made this feel less like a conversation and more like an operation. Emily watched without moving, but her eyes tracked every step, every decision, because now the stakes were no longer theoretical. Mark inserted the drive. The screen flickered. Then a list of files appeared, timestamps, internal folders, and one labeled simply, revision log. Mark glanced up. "You want me to open it?" he asked. Daniel did not take his eyes off the screen. "Now," he said, and Mark clicked. Lines of track changes filled the display. Red and green annotations showing edits made over time. Daniel stepped closer, reading, his jaw tightening as he saw the pattern. The original projections replaced, comments removed, entire sections rewritten, all under a single user profile. Richard Halpern, he cleaned it. Mark said quietly, almost to himself. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his posture hardened. Not anger, not shock, something more controlled than that. Something like a recalculation of trust. Scroll, Daniel said, and Mark did. Deeper into the log, until a new detail appeared. One that had not been in the printed documents, a timestamp tied to an external file transfer, a destination address that did not belong to the company. Mark froze for a second, then looked up. "That is not internal," he said. Daniel leaned in, reading the string of characters, the domain unfamiliar but structured, deliberate. "What is it?" one of the remaining executives asked, and Mark hesitated before answering. "It looks like he exported the original model," he said, to an outside firm. The air shifted again, sharper this time, because this was no longer about a bad decision or internal oversight. This pointed somewhere else entirely. Daniel straightened slowly, his eyes moving from the screen to Emily. "Did you know about this?" he asked, and there was something new in his tone, not doubt, not accusation, something closer to urgency. Emily shook her head once. "No," she said, then added, "But I knew the numbers did not disappear by accident, and that line connected everything." Daniel nodded, then reached for his phone again, this time dialing without pause. "Get legal on standby," he said when the line connected, "and pull every contract tied to Halpern in the last 2 years. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, then looked at the screen one more time, at the external address that now felt like the center of the entire problem. "Find out who that belongs to," he said to Mark, and Mark began typing immediately, pulling up registries, databases, cross-references, the seconds stretching as the system processed. Emily stood still, but her breathing had slowed, controlled, because now the situation had moved beyond what she had carried alone. Now it was unfolding in real time. Mark's fingers stopped, his eyes widening slightly as the result loaded. "Daniel," he said, his voice lower than before, "you are going to want to see this." And when Daniel looked at the name tied to that external firm, he realized this was not just about a trusted executive breaking protocol. It was about someone inside his company feeding his biggest competitor, and the person connected to that firm was someone he had trusted even more than Halpern. Mark turned the screen slightly so Daniel could see it clearly, the name on the registry sitting there in plain text, not hidden, not coded, just undeniable, Whitmore. Strategic Partners. Daniel did not react at first. His eyes stayed on the name as if reading it again would change it, but it did not. It stayed exactly where it was, owned and registered under a private holding structure he recognized immediately, one he had set up himself years ago for a different purpose. "That is impossible," one of the executives whispered, but Daniel raised a hand slightly, stopping the room from spiraling. His voice came out calm, almost too calm. "No," he said, "it is not impossible." And that shift in tone was enough to make everyone at the table understand that this was now personal. Mark looked between them, uncertain. "You own that entity," he said carefully, and Daniel nodded once, slow, deliberate. "On paper," he replied, then reached for the USB drive again, holding it between his fingers as if it had weight beyond its size. Emily watched him closely, not interrupting, because something in the way he processed this was different from before, less reactive, more strategic. That entity was supposed to be dormant. Daniel continued, more to himself now. It has no active operations, he added, then looked back at the screen, at the timestamps, at the transfer logs. Unless someone reactivated it, Emily said quietly, and that line landed exactly where it needed to. Daniel's eyes lifted to hers, sharp again, but clearer now. Or used it because it would not trigger internal alerts, he replied, finishing the thought. And in that moment, the direction of the conversation shifted again. This was no longer just about who made the decision. It was about who understood the system well enough to bypass it. Mark leaned forward, scrolling further through the log. There are multiple transfers, he said. Not just one. He added, clicking through timestamps that stretched back months, each one tied to the same external entity. Daniel exhaled slowly, then placed the USB drive back on the table with a soft, controlled motion. Pull the access records for that entity, he said, and Mark nodded, already typing, but Emily stepped forward slightly, just enough to interrupt the rhythm. You will not find a direct login, she said, and that was new. Daniel turned to her. Why? He asked, and this time there was no impatience, just focus. Emily reached for the document again, flipping to a page near the back, because the access was routed through a mirrored credential, she said, pointing to a line of code printed in the margin, something most people would have ignored. It mimics an executive-level authentication without triggering a flag. Mark leaned closer, his eyes scanning the line. That is not standard, he said. It is not even documented. Emily nodded. It was part of the original model, she said, and that added a new layer entirely. Daniel's gaze sharpened. You built this, he said, not accusing, but connecting. Emily met his eyes, steady. We built a safeguard for rapid routing access, she corrected. It was never meant to be used like this. Daniel absorbed that, then looked back at the screen, at the logs that now felt less like anomalies and more like a pattern someone had been exploiting for months. So whoever did this, he said slowly, understood both my system and yours. Emily nodded once. Yes, she said, and that confirmation narrowed the field in a way that made the room feel smaller, more contained. Mark's fingers paused over the keyboard. I am tracing the access path, he said. It is bouncing through internal nodes, he added, then stopped, his expression tightening as the trace resolved. Daniel, he said again, quieter this time. The origin point is inside your executive network. Daniel did not react outwardly, but his eyes shifted, calculating, aligning timelines, roles, access levels. Then he asked the question that moved everything forward. Which terminal? Mark hesitated for half a second, then turned the screen fully toward him. Your office, he said, and that changed everything. Not because it implicated Daniel, but because it meant someone had been operating inside the one place he believed was controlled, secure, untouchable. The silence that followed was sharp, focused, and for the first time, Emily did not look at Daniel. She looked at the door leading out of the restaurant, as if anticipating something that had not happened yet. Daniel noticed, his gaze following hers for a brief moment before returning to the screen, then to her. You expected this, he said, and it was not a guess anymore. Emily finally looked back at him, her expression calm, but there was something different now, something prepared. I expected that whoever did this would not stop just because you started asking questions, she said, and as if the moment had been waiting for that exact realization, Daniel's phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a single incoming message from a number he did not recognize. And when he picked it up and read the first line, he understood that this was no longer contained inside the company, because the message said, you should not have opened that file. Daniel did not put the phone down right away. His eyes stayed on the message as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less direct, but they did not. They stayed exactly as written, clear and controlled, and that told him more than the threat itself. This was not panic. This was someone who believed they were still in control. That is not random, he said quietly, then turned the screen toward Emily without a word. She read it once, then lifted her eyes back to him. No, she replied. It is a response, and that single word shifted the dynamic again, because it meant whoever sent it was watching, not reacting blindly. Daniel nodded slowly, then typed a single reply without asking for input, his fingers moving with deliberate precision. "Then you should not have sent it," he said aloud as he hit send. One of the executives looked at him sharply. "You are engaging," he said, and there was concern in his voice now. Daniel did not look away from the phone. "I am confirming," he replied, and that distinction mattered, because seconds later, the phone buzzed again, faster this time. As if the other side had been waiting, Daniel opened the message. His expression did not change, but his posture shifted slightly, leaning forward. "They are inside the network right now," he said, and turned the screen so the others could see. The message read, "Check your system logs again." Mark reacted immediately, his hands moving back to the secure laptop, pulling up live access records. The screen flickered as new entries populated in real time, timestamps updating every second. "There is an active session," he said, his voice tightening. "It is using executive-level credentials." Daniel stepped closer, his presence now focused entirely on the data. "Trace it," he said. Mark nodded, running the trace again, but this time the path shifted dynamically, bouncing across nodes faster than before. "It is masking itself," Mark added. "This is not just a static breach." Emily stepped forward, closer to the screen than before, her eyes scanning the pattern, not the surface data, but the movement beneath it. "They are not masking," she said, and that stopped Mark mid-sentence. Daniel turned to her. "Then what are they doing?" he asked. Emily pointed to the sequence of nodes, her finger moving in a controlled line. "They are rerouting through your audit triggers," she said. "Every time you look for them, they move one step ahead." Daniel's eyes narrowed, understanding forming quickly now. "So we stop looking directly," he said, and that was the shift, the moment where he stopped reacting and started adapting. Emily nodded once. "You let them think you are following the wrong path," she replied, and now they were aligned, not as opposing sides, but as two people solving the same problem from different angles. Daniel turned to Mark. "Pull the last stable node before the movement started," he said. Mark typed quickly, isolating a timestamp from minutes earlier, freezing the pattern at its origin point. "Got it," he said. "It is a fixed terminal," he added. Daniel leaned in, reading the identifier, then exhaled slowly. "Conference room B," he said, and that was new. That was specific, a physical location inside his own building. Emily's gaze sharpened slightly. "That room is not on the executive floor," she said. Daniel shook his head once. "No," he replied. "It is one level below." And that detail mattered, because it meant someone had chosen a space close enough to access high-level systems, but far enough to avoid attention. Mark looked up. "Do you want me to lock the session?" he asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked at Emily instead, and for the first time, he was not just asking for information, he was asking for strategy. Emily held his gaze, then shook her head slightly. "If you lock it, they disappear," she said, "and you lose the only real location you have." Daniel nodded once. "Decision made." "Then we do not lock it," he said, and that shifted control again, because now they were not chasing, they were positioning. Daniel picked up his phone, dialing a different number this time. "Security," he said when the line connected. "I need access to conference room B now." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, then looked at Emily. "You are coming with me," he said. Not as an order, but as a conclusion. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then untied the knot of her apron, folding it neatly and placing it on the edge of the table. A small, deliberate action that marked the moment she stepped out of her role and into something else entirely. "Lead the way," she said, and as Daniel turned toward the exit, the rain still streaking the glass behind him, neither of them noticed that the secure laptop screen had updated again, a new line appearing in the log, a message embedded directly into the system feed, one that Mark had not yet read, because it did not look like code at all. It read, "You are already too late." The elevator doors closed with a soft, controlled slide, sealing Daniel and Emily inside a space that suddenly felt too quiet, too contained, the hum of the building replacing the noise of the restaurant as the floor indicator began to descend. "Conference room B is not used after 6, Daniel said, his voice steady, but his eyes fixed on the numbers changing above the door. Emily stood beside him, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her attention sharp. "That is exactly why it was chosen," she replied. And that small observation carried weight, because it meant whoever was behind this was not just bold. They were deliberate. The elevator reached the lower level with a soft chime. The doors opening to a corridor lined with muted lighting and glass panels, the kind of corporate design meant to feel open but controlled. Daniel stepped out first, his pace measured but direct. Emily followed, her gaze moving across the hallway, taking in details most people would ignore: the faint reflection of movement in the glass, the slight flicker in one of the ceiling lights. "Security should be here," Daniel said, checking his watch. But as they approached the door marked Conference Room B, it was still closed. No guards, no sign of interruption. "That is not a delay," Emily said quietly, stopping just short of the door. Daniel turned to her. "What do you mean?" he asked, and she nodded toward the small digital panel beside the handle. "Look at the access log," she said. Daniel stepped closer, tapping the screen. A list of recent entries appeared, time-stamped, precise, and one line stood out immediately: accessed 2 minutes ago. Authorized. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We are not first," he said, and that realization shifted the pressure again, because now they were not approaching a static situation. They were walking into something already in motion. Daniel reached for the handle, but Emily's hand moved slightly, not stopping him, just enough to make him pause. "If they wanted to hide, they would have logged out," she said, her voice calm. "They want you to walk in." Daniel studied her for a brief moment, then nodded once, accepting the implication. He opened the door. The room inside was dimly lit, a single overhead light casting a focused glow on the conference table, and there, at the center, sat an open laptop, its screen active, not locked, not hidden, just waiting. Daniel stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning the space. No one else in the room, no movement, just the quiet presence of something left behind intentionally. Emily followed, closing the door behind them with a soft click that echoed louder than expected. Daniel approached the table, stopping just short of the laptop. "That is not careless," he said, and Emily nodded. "It is an invitation," she replied. Daniel leaned in, reading the screen, a single window open, a document titled Final Integration Summary. But the content was not numbers, not projections. It was a message, typed in clean, precise text. "You are looking in the wrong place." Daniel's expression did not change, but his hand moved to the edge of the laptop, steady, controlled. "Then show me the right one," he said under his breath, as if the person behind it could hear him. Emily stepped closer, her eyes scanning not just the message, but the details around it: the cursor position, the system tray, the faint reflection of the room in the screen. "They are still connected," she said, and that shifted everything again. Daniel looked at her. "How do you know?" he asked, and she pointed to a small icon in the corner of the display, a remote session indicator, subtle, easy to miss, because they want to watch your reaction, she said. Daniel straightened slightly, then did something unexpected. He did not close the laptop. He did not disconnect it. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from it, as if taking a seat in a conversation that had already begun. "Then let them watch," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. Emily remained standing for a second, studying him, then moved to the side of the table, positioning herself where she could see both the screen and the room behind them. Because this was no longer just about information, it was about control of the moment. Daniel placed his hands on the table, fingers interlocked, his posture composed. "You wanted my attention," he said, looking directly at the screen. "You have it." And for a brief second, nothing happened, just the quiet hum of the building and the soft flicker of the overhead light. Then the cursor on the screen moved on its own, slowly, deliberately, and new text began to appear, one line at a time. "Good," it typed. "Now we can talk." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in recognition of something she had anticipated, because this was no longer a hidden operation, it was a controlled exchange. Daniel leaned back, just slightly, his expression unreadable. "Start talking," he said, and the cursor blinked once, then continued. "Before we do," the message appeared, "you should know who is really sitting behind you." And at that exact moment, the overhead light flickered once more, just enough to cast a shifting shadow on the glass wall behind them. revealing a reflection that had not been there a second ago. Daniel did not turn around immediately, and that choice was not hesitation, it was timing. His eyes stayed on the screen for one more second, as if the message mattered more than the shadow behind him. Then he spoke, calm and even. "If you wanted me surprised, you would have stayed silent," he said, and only then did he shift his gaze slightly, not fully turning, just enough to catch the reflection in the glass wall. A figure standing near the door, still, composed, not rushing, not hiding. Emily did not move either, but her eyes had already adjusted, tracking the reflection instead of the person directly. "You expected someone," Daniel said quietly, and this time it was not directed at the screen, it was directed at Emily. She nodded once, subtle, controlled. "I expected the system to react," she replied. "I did not expect it to be this direct," and that distinction mattered, because it meant the plan had accelerated. Daniel finally turned, slow and deliberate, facing the figure. Behind him, a man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, dressed in a dark suit that matched the tone of the building itself, familiar in a way that did not require introduction. "Richard," Daniel said, his voice level, not surprised, not welcoming, just precise. Richard Halpern stepped forward slightly, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Daniel," he replied, his tone calm, almost conversational, as if they were meeting for a scheduled discussion instead of standing at the center of a breach. "I was wondering how long it would take," he added, glancing briefly at Emily, then back to Daniel. "Longer than I expected," Daniel said, and there was a faint shift in his posture now, not defensive, but anchored, as if he had already decided where this was going. Richard's eyes flicked to the laptop, then back. "You always did underestimate how quickly information moves once it is out of your control," he said, and that line carried more than just observation. Emily stepped slightly to the side, changing her angle, placing the table between her and Richard, not retreating, just adjusting. "You are not here to stop this," she said, her voice calm but direct. Richard's gaze settled on her fully now, studying her in a way that suggested recognition, not of her face, but of her role. "No," he said, "I am here because you finally connected the right pieces." And that confirmed it. This was not damage control. This was escalation. Daniel walked around the table slowly, placing himself between Richard and the laptop, not blocking, just redefining the space. "You used my own structure against me," he said, and it was not a question. Richard nodded once, almost approving. "You built a system designed to scale," he replied. "I simply made sure it could be redirected." Daniel stopped a few feet from him, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain control. "And the external transfers," Daniel continued. "You fed them to a competitor." Richard's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, something closer to confirmation than denial. "Information moves to where it has value," he said, and that was as close to an admission as he needed to give. Emily watched the exchange carefully, her attention not just on what was being said, but on what was not, on the timing, on the gaps. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing it, then did something unexpected. He did not confront, he did not accuse further. Instead, he stepped back half a pace and looked at the laptop again, then at Mark's secure device still connected remotely in the restaurant above, then back at Richard. "You wanted me to see this," he said, and that shifted the conversation again, because now it was not about discovery, it was about intent. Richard's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Of course," he said, "you do not change direction, unless you believe you are making the decision yourself." Daniel exhaled once, then placed his hand lightly on the back of the chair he had been sitting in moments earlier, grounding himself in the physical space. "So this is the part where you explain why," he said, and his tone was steady, controlled, but there was something else beneath it now, something calculated. Richard tilted his head slightly, considering. "Why?" he repeated, as if the word itself was too simple. "Because your empire stopped evolving," he said, "and I found a way to move it forward without your permission." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly at that, not in anger, but in recognition of the logic being presented, flawed, but structured. Daniel nodded once, as if acknowledging the argument without accepting it. Then he glanced briefly at Emily, just for a second, and in that look there was something unspoken, alignment, timing, A shared understanding that this conversation was not the end, it was the setup. Daniel turned back to Richard, his expression unchanged. "Then let us keep moving forward," he said, and that line shifted the balance completely, because for the first time, he was not reacting to Richard's plan. He was stepping into it on his own terms, and Richard noticed, his eyes narrowing slightly, just enough to show that something had changed, because what Daniel did next was not what someone cornered would do. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it face down on the table, directly between them. "You said information moves where it has value," Daniel said quietly. "Let us see how much yours is worth." And as the phone vibrated once against the wood, signaling an incoming connection already in progress, Emily finally understood that Daniel had not just walked into this room to confront the truth. He had come prepared to broadcast it. The phone vibrated again, stronger this time, the low hum against the polished wood cutting through the silence in the room. Daniel did not pick it up immediately. He let it sit there between them like a line drawn, visible, deliberate. Then he turned it over slowly, the screen already active, a live call interface open, muted, connected. "You are recording," Richard said, and for the first time, there was a slight shift in his tone. Not fear, but recalibration. Daniel met his eyes, steady. "Not recording," he replied, "broadcasting." And that word landed differently, because it implied an audience, not just evidence. Emily's gaze flicked to the screen, catching a glimpse of the interface, a secure internal channel, one used only for board-level emergency sessions. "You opened a live board line," she said quietly, and Daniel nodded once, confirming it without looking away from Richard. "Every senior partner just got pulled into this feed," he added, and now the stakes expanded beyond the room, beyond the building, into something that could not be contained. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating again, but this time the margin was thinner. "You think exposure changes the outcome," he said, his voice still controlled, but the ease from before was gone. Daniel stepped closer, not aggressive, just firm, closing the distance enough to make the moment undeniable. "I think it removes your ability to control the narrative," he replied, and that was the shift, because until now, Richard had been operating in controlled shadows, shaping information, redirecting systems. But this forced everything into the open. Emily moved slightly to the side, her position now aligned with Daniel rather than separate, her eyes tracking both men, but also the screen, because the feed was active, live, and somewhere above them, in offices and homes across the city, people were watching. Daniel tapped the screen once, unmuting the call. A soft tone confirmed the connection. Then he spoke, clear and direct. "This is Daniel Whitmore," he said. "If you are on this line, stay on it." And that was all he needed to say, because the silence that followed was not empty. It was occupied, filled with listeners who had not yet spoken. Richard let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without humor. "You are forcing a confrontation without understanding the full scope," he said, and that was not a warning. It was a statement. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Then explain it," he said, and his tone invited it, not out of curiosity, but out of strategy, because every word now carried weight beyond the room. Richard glanced briefly at the laptop, then back at Daniel. "You think this is about a single division," he said. "About one integration failure," he added, then shook his head once. "This is about structural stagnation," he continued. "Your company stopped adapting 2 years ago." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly at that, not rejecting the premise, but recognizing the framing. Daniel remained still, listening, allowing the space to unfold, because now the more Richard spoke, the more he revealed. "I accelerated what was already inevitable," Richard said. "I created pressure points, redirected assets, forced movement," he added, and with each sentence, the shape of his plan became clearer. Not random sabotage, but a controlled redirection of power. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the structure without agreeing to its justification. "And the competitor," he said. "You handed them our advantage." Richard's expression did not change. "I gave them access," he corrected. What they did with it was predictable, and that correction mattered, because it showed intent without admitting failure. Emily stepped forward half a step, her voice cutting in with precision. "You did not just move information," she said. You rewrote the outcome, and that was the first time she had directly challenged him in this space. Richard looked at her again, more focused this time. And you rebuilt the piece that made it possible, he replied, nodding slightly toward the model she had created years ago. Do not pretend you are not part of this equation. Emily did not step back, her expression steady. I built a system to move faster, she said. You used it to erase accountability. And that line shifted the weight again. Daniel glanced briefly at her, then back to Richard, and something in that exchange confirmed what he needed, not just the facts, but the alignment. He reached for the phone again, adjusting its position so the audio was clear. You wanted to move the company forward, Daniel said, his voice even, controlled. Then let us move it in the open. And that was the moment, the pivot, because now this was no longer a hidden conflict. It was a public one. Richard's eyes narrowed further. Just slightly, enough to show that. The balance had shifted again, but not completely. Not yet, because he had not lost control. He had only been forced to change how he used it. You are still missing one piece, Richard said. And there was something different in his tone now, something that suggested he was not finished. Daniel did not respond immediately. He watched him, waiting, allowing the next move to reveal itself. And when Richard finally spoke again, his words did not go to Daniel. They went to the line, to the unseen. Audience listening. Ask him, Richard said, his gaze still on Daniel. Why his office was the origin point. And that single sentence shifted the entire room again. Because it was not just a question, it was a direct challenge to the one thing Daniel believed he still controlled. And for the first time since the broadcast began, the silence on the line above them was no longer passive. It was waiting for an answer Daniel had not yet given. The room did not move, but the pressure shifted instantly, the kind that comes when a question is no longer rhetorical but directed. Daniel did not look at the phone. He did not look at the executives listening on the line. He looked at Richard, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was no trace of reaction in his expression, only calculation. You are right, Daniel said, his voice calm, measured. And that admission landed heavier than denial would have. One of the voices on the line finally broke through, sharp and immediate. Daniel, what does that mean? But Daniel did not answer them yet. He stepped past Richard, moving toward the glass wall, his reflection faint against the city lights beyond. Then he turned back, placing himself in full view of both Richard and the unseen audience. My office was the origin point, he repeated, not avoiding it, not softening it. Because the access came from my credentials, and that clarified the accusation, but did not resolve it. Emily watched him closely, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition that this was not a confession. It was a setup. Richard tilted his head, just slightly. And you expect them to believe that was not you, he said, his tone steady, but now carrying a faint edge, because this was the moment he had been waiting for. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a second device, smaller than his phone, a secure authentication key, metallic, worn at the edges from use. He placed it on the table beside the laptop. My credentials require this, he said, tapping the key once, the sound sharp against the wood. Every executive-level action is tied to a physical token, he added. And that detail changed the equation entirely. One of the voices on the line spoke again. Slower this time. Daniel, are you saying someone used your key? Daniel shook his head once. Precise. I am saying the system recorded my credentials, he replied, then looked directly at Richard. But it did not record where my key actually was. And that distinction hung in the air for a second before landing. Emily stepped forward slightly, her gaze moving between the key and the laptop, understanding forming quickly. You have location tracking enabled, she said, and Daniel nodded. Since last year, he confirmed, then picked up his phone again, tapping into a secured application, the screen lighting up with a clean interface, a single timeline, a map overlay with precise coordinates. Every authentication event logs the physical position of the key, he said, then turned the screen outward, first toward Emily, then toward Richard, and finally placing it flat on the table so the audio line could capture his voice clearly. At the exact time this access occurred, Daniel continued, his voice steady. My key was not in my office. He tapped the screen once, zooming in, the location pinned sharp, undeniable. It was here, and the address displayed beneath it, a hospital across town, timestamped to the minute. Emily's eyes flickered across the data, confirming the alignment, then lifted back to him. And in that moment, the entire narrative shifted, because this was not just explanation. It was evidence, documented, verifiable, impossible to dismiss. One of the voices on the line spoke again, quieter now. "Why were you there?" Daniel did not hesitate this time. "Because my father was in surgery," he said, and there was no performance in it, no added weight, just fact. And that detail did something else entirely. It grounded the timeline in something human, something that could be checked, cross-referenced, confirmed. Richard's expression changed, just slightly. The first real fracture in his composure, not panic, but recalculation, because this piece did not fit the version he had constructed. Daniel watched him carefully, then spoke again. "So whoever accessed my system," he said, "did it without my key and without my presence." And that narrowed the possibilities to something much smaller, much more specific. Emily reached for the document still on the table, flipping back to the page with the mirrored credential code, then looked at Daniel. "The mirrored authentication," she said. "It bypasses the physical key requirement." Daniel nodded once. "Which means," he added, turning back to Richard, "this was not just internal access." His voice lowered slightly, not in volume, but in precision. This was engineered, and that word shifted the balance completely, because now this was no longer about misuse. It was about design. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the key on the table, then back to Daniel. And for the first time, he did not respond immediately. The silence, stretching just long enough to confirm what the evidence had already established. The power in the room had moved, not completely, but enough, because now Daniel was no longer defending. He was defining the terms. Emily stepped back half a pace, her eyes still on Richard, waiting, because the next move would reveal whether this was where it ended or where it truly began. And when Richard finally spoke, his voice was still calm. But there was something different in it now, something sharper. "You proved you were not there," he said, "but you still have not proven you were not involved." And that line cut directly into the only gap left, because it shifted the question from access to intent. And as the silence settled again, heavier than before, Daniel realized that the next answer would not just clear his name, it would expose something he had not yet said out loud. The room held its breath, the weight of Richard's words settling into every corner of the glass walls. And Daniel did not answer right away, because for the first time since this began, the question was no longer about systems or strategy. It was about him, about something he had avoided even while controlling everything else. His hand moved slowly toward the phone on the table, but it stopped halfway, hovering there as if the next action carried more consequence than any decision he had made. That night, Emily watched him closely, her expression shifting, not in doubt, but in recognition, because something in his posture had changed, something quieter, more exposed. Daniel's eyes lowered for a moment, not to the screen, not to the data, but somewhere inward, and the room around him seemed to fade just enough for something else to surface. A memory he had not allowed himself to revisit, the sterile white of a hospital hallway, the low hum of machines behind a closed door, his father sitting alone on a narrow bed months ago, older than he remembered, smaller somehow, holding a folder of medical reports with hands that trembled slightly. "You should not be here this late," his father had said back then, forcing a small smile. "You have a company to run." And Daniel had checked his watch, the same watch on his wrist now, already calculating his next meeting. "I will come back tomorrow," he had replied, distracted, distant, already halfway out the door before the sentence finished. And his father had nodded, quietly, as if that answer was enough, as if waiting was something he had learned to accept. The memory tightened in Daniel's chest, sharper than anything Richard had said, because it was not about control or power. It was about something he had failed to see when it mattered. And now, standing in this room, surrounded by screens and voices and evidence, he felt it clearly, the cost of always choosing later. His hand moved again, this time not toward the broadcast, but toward a different contact on his phone. His fingers hesitated, then pressed. The call began to ring. Once, twice, and for the first time that night, Daniel's composure cracked just slightly, not in his voice, but in the way he held the phone, tighter than before, as if it might slip away if he did not. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, his tone sharper now, sensing the shift, but Daniel did not answer him. He kept his focus on the call, on the sound of it connecting, until finally, a voice came through, softer, familiar. "Daniel," his father said, and that single word carried more weight than everything else in the room. Daniel exhaled, a breath he had been holding longer than he realized. "I should have stayed," he said, his voice lower now, unguarded, and the silence on the line stretched for a second before his father responded. "You are here now," he said, and that simple reply broke something open, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the first tear to form, unnoticed by anyone but Emily, who stood still, understanding without interrupting. Daniel wiped it away quickly, but the change had already happened, because this was not about proving innocence anymore. It was about choosing what mattered in a moment that could not be delayed again. He straightened slightly, but not fully, not returning to the same controlled posture as before. Something of that vulnerability remained, grounding him differently. "I need you to stay on the line," Daniel said quietly, and his father agreed without question, the connection remaining open, steady. Daniel then lifted his gaze back to Richard, and for the first time, there was no calculation in it, only clarity. "You asked if I was involved," he said, his voice calm but no longer distant. "I was," he added, and that statement shifted the room again, but not in the way Richard expected. Daniel took a step forward, placing himself fully between the laptop and Richard. "I built a system that allowed someone like you to do this," he continued. "I chose speed over oversight, growth over accountability." And every word was precise, deliberate, owned. Emily watched him, her expression softening slightly, because this was not weakness. This was control in a different form. Daniel nodded once, as if confirming it, to himself as much as to anyone else, then reached for the phone again, turning it slightly so the open line could capture his voice clearly. "But I am also the one who ends it," he said, and that was the shift, the moment where accountability turned into action. Richard's eyes narrowed, the edge returning. "You still do not have proof of intent," he said, pushing back, but Daniel did not argue. He simply reached for the USB drive again, holding it up between them, then placed it beside the phone. "Deliberate, final, no," Daniel replied. "But I have something better." And his gaze moved briefly to Emily, just for a second, because she knew what he had not yet said out loud. And as the silence tightened around them once more, Daniel realized that the final piece was not in the data, not in the system, but in the one thing he had not yet revealed. And it was about to change everything. Daniel held the USB drive for 1 second longer, then placed it down with quiet certainty, his eyes steady on Richard. "The final piece is not in your system," he said. "It is in the one place you never accounted for." And before Richard could respond, Daniel turned, already moving toward the door, his phone still connected, his father's quiet breathing still on the line. "Stay with me," Daniel said softly into the phone as he stepped into the hallway. Emily followed without hesitation, her pace matching his, not asking questions, because she already understood that this was no longer about winning the room. It was about finishing something that had started long before tonight. The elevator doors opened as if waiting, and Daniel stepped inside, his reflection in the mirrored wall no longer the same controlled figure from before. Something had shifted, something grounded. The ride up felt shorter than it should have, and when the doors opened again, the sterile brightness of the hospital corridor replaced the glass and steel of the office below, the scent of antiseptic, the quiet urgency of nurses moving past, everything real, immediate. Daniel walked faster now, not running, but no longer measured, each step carrying something heavier than before. Emily slowed slightly behind him, then stopped near the entrance to the ward, watching as he moved forward alone, because this part was not hers to enter. Daniel pushed open the door to the recovery room, and there, sitting upright in the hospital bed, was his father, pale but awake, the same man from his memory, but now fully present, and beside him stood a nurse adjusting the 4-line, who glanced up, saw Daniel, and gave a small knowing smile before stepping back, leaving the space to them. Daniel stopped just inside the doorway for a fraction of a second, as if the moment needed to settle. Then he crossed the room in 3 quick steps, his hand reaching out, not calculated, not controlled, just instinct. He took his father's hand, gripping it tightly. And for the first time, there was no hesitation, no delay. "I am here," Daniel said, his voice breaking just slightly. And his father looked at him, really looked, eyes softening. Then he squeezed Daniel's hand back, firm despite the weakness. "I know," he replied, and that simple exchange broke the last barrier Daniel had been holding. His shoulders dropped, the tension releasing, and he leaned forward, wrapping his arms around his father in a tight embrace, the kind that did not measure time or control, just presence. His father's hand moved up, resting against Daniel's back, holding him there, steady, forgiving without needing explanation. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, the first tear falling freely now, not hidden, not wiped away, just there, honest, the room quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitor. The nurse standing near the door, watching for a second, then turning away, giving them space without a word. Emily remained outside, visible through the glass, her posture still, her expression calm, understanding that this was the moment everything else had been leading toward. Daniel finally pulled back slightly, still holding his father's hand, his grip not loosening. "I should have been here sooner," he said, and this time there was no distance in the words. His father shook his head gently, his thumb brushing against Daniel's knuckles in a quiet, reassuring motion. "You are here now," he said again. But this time it carried more. It carried acceptance, release, something that did not need to be earned. Daniel let out a slow breath, his forehead lowering until it rested lightly against his father's hand, grounding himself in something real, something that could not be manipulated or redirected. And in that moment, everything outside the room, the systems, the company, the conflict, all of it shifted into its proper place, not gone, but no longer defining. Daniel straightened slightly, still holding on, his voice quieter now, steadier. "I am not leaving again," he said, and his father smiled faintly, a tired but genuine expression. "Good," he replied, and as the monitor continued its steady rhythm, and the hallway beyond carried on with its quiet movement, Daniel understood something he had missed for too long. That control was never about holding everything together. It was about knowing what mattered enough to never let go. And as he tightened his grip just slightly, his father's hand steady in his own, the only thing that remained was a quiet truth that settled deeper than anything else that night. Some things are not meant to be managed, Daniel thought, his gaze softening. They are meant to be held.